May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So we're into our 5th week of our series looking at various hymns of faith and what they have to teach us about our Christian faith in the 21st century. One of the last centuries, the 20th century's most loved hymns is Great is Thy Faithfulness. It was written by Thomas Chisholm and is a testament to the faithfulness of God through his own very ordinary life. Thomas was born in a log cabin in Franklin in Kentucky, and he became a Christian when he was 27 and entered the ministry when he was 36. Because he was in poor health, he was forced to retire from the ministry after just 1 year. For the rest of his life, Thomas spent many years living in New Jersey and working as a life insurance agent. Still, even with a desk job, he managed to write nearly 1,200 poems throughout his life, including many that were published as hymns. Thomas explained towards the end of his life, "My income has not been large at any time due to impaired health in the early years, which has followed me on until now. Although I must not fail to record here the unfailing faithfulness of a covenant-keeping God, and that he has given me many wonderful displays of his providing care, for which I am filled with astonishing gratefulness." Sometimes life is difficult, and in the midst of difficulty, it's hard to see sometimes the faithfulness of God. To see God's faithfulness in times of faithlessness is a big leap of faith on our part. And our second reading this morning came from the book of Lamentations, which is basically a set of funeral dirges written by the prophet Jeremiah. And chapter 3 is the third of those. Jeremiah was around at the time that Jerusalem fell and the Israelites went into exile, and he was really saddened by what had happened, as anyone would be, to see their home city destroyed and carried off by invaders. And it must have been almost impossible for him to see that any good could come out of it. He knew why it had happened. He knew that it was the faithlessness of Israel, much of which we talked about when we looked at the prophet Hosea earlier in the year. But still, in the midst of all this faithlessness on the part of the people, all this calamity, all this destruction and death, it's hard to keep faith with God sometimes and to remain sure of God's faithfulness towards us. I don't know all your stories. You don't know all my stories. I've shared some with you and you've shared some with me. But maybe there have been times in your life where you have gone through difficulties. You may well be going through difficulties now. What do we do then? What do we do when God feels so far away? When we feel alone? When we feel abandoned? How do we keep faith in these dark hours of the soul? How do we keep trusting in God even when we can't hear him or see him? Lamentations chapter 3. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me, again and again all day long. He has made my skin and my flesh grow old, and he has broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has barred my way with blocks of stone, and he has made my paths crooked. Like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding, he dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without help. He drew his bow and made me the target for his arrows. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughingstock of all my people. They mock me in song all day long. He has filled me with bitter herbs and given me gall to drink. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. There are many, many different images of God that we find in scriptures, and most of them are very positive and encouraging. God is our Father. The Lord is my shepherd. God is our ever-present help in time of trouble, and on it goes. But this picture that's painted here in the 3rd chapter of Lamentations is not a pretty picture. And it's almost impossible for us to conceive of God as an angry, aggressive, and even adversarial God. But that's the picture that's being painted here. Miroslav Volf, a Christian theologian from Croatia, used to struggle and reject the concept of God's wrath. He thought the idea of an angry God was barbaric and completely unworthy of a God of love. But then Croatia and other parts of the world, other countries in that part of the world, experienced a brutal war. My last resistance, try that again, Michael. My last resistance, Miroslav said, to the idea of God's wrath was a casualty of the war between 1992 and 1994 in the former Yugoslavia, the region from which I come. According to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed and over 3 million were displaced. My villages and cities were destroyed. My people shelled day in and day out, some of them brutalized beyond imagination, and I could not imagine God not being angry. Or think of Rwanda in the last decade of the 20th century, where 800,000 people were hacked to death in 100 days. How did God react to the carnage? By doting on the perpetrators in a grandfatherly fashion? By refusing to condemn the bloodbath, but instead affirming the perpetrators' basic goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. And the words we read here in chapter 3 talk about God's wrath towards a people who have constantly walked away from him, constantly turned their back on them. And if you remember all that time we spent in Hosea warned them over and over and over again to turn back to God, and what the consequences would be if they didn't. And still they walked away, and now they are suffering the consequences. The word wrath in Hebrew is iba, and it's an extension of that word, if you like. It means to go beyond, to the other side or the opposite. It's a spillover, it's a crossover effect. It's not just anger, it's anger over and beyond, over the top, outside the norm and out of range. It's more than anyone could be able to stand or to suffer or to stomach, more than anyone could imagine or endure or be exposed to. This is anger beyond everything else. Beyond everything else. And this is definitely God that's being talked about. Each verse from verse 2 speaks of what the Lord did in these passages. 26 times actions are given to God in this. Some of them, in verse 2, he drove me, he made me walk in darkness. In verse 3, he selected me, he turned his hand against me. In verse 4, he sickened me, he made my skin old, and destroyed my flesh. In verse 5, he surrounded and besieged me. In verse 6, he made me to dwell in darkness. Verse 7, he shackled and weighed me down with chains. In verse 8, he stonewalled, he shut out my prayer and didn't listen to me. In 9, he sidetracked me, made my paths crooked. In verse 10, He spotted me like a bear waiting or a lion in hiding. He seized me in verse 11 and mangled me. He shot me with a bow in verse 12, and he allowed my heart to seep in verse 13. In verse 14, he scorned me and made me a laughingstock. In verse 15, he soaked me with bitter herbs. In verse 16, he smashed and broke my teeth. These are not pretty pictures. These are not the pictures that we normally associate with God. And they are very, very personal. These are not general accusations by the writer that, God does bad things from time to time. These are all, he did this to me. These are all God attacking the writer. The author uses the pronoun I 4 times, me 10 times, and my 8 times in these 16 verses. That's 19 times in 16 verses that the writer refers to himself. He feels that God has hunted him, has hobbled and halted and handicapped him for a run of alliteration. God has had a go at him. And where is God in this suffering? And that's a question that we may have asked ourselves at some point in our lives. When we have been hurting, when we've been suffering, when it feels like the whole world is against us, where is God in this suffering? We pick chapter 3 up at verse 18. So I say, my splendour is gone, and all that I'd hoped from the Lord. I remembered my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust, and there may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone, or to crush anyone underfoot. Sorry, I'll read that. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone, to crush underfoot all prisoners in the land, to deny people their rights before the Most High, to deprive them of justice. Would not the Lord see such things? Who can speak and have it happen if the Lord has not decreed it? It is not from the mouth of the Most High that both calamities and good things come. Why should the living complain when punished for their sins? It's been said that no matter how dark the night is, day will come. And sometimes the night is very dark. And if you've ever been to somewhere where there's no artificial light, it can be really, really dark. But the dawn comes. New every morning, the dawn comes. And at some point the light will break over the horizon. And in the midst of the darkness, you see the hope of a bright new day. In the midst of darkness, in the midst of despair, there is always hope. And sometimes we find it hard to hope. Sometimes we find it hard to hold on. And there are those around who like to turn words into acronyms to make them easier to remember, or to give us a little bit more of encouragement. And sometimes, I must admit, I find these a little twitty, but I'm going to give you a few here. All acronyms for the word hope. Hope is healing of past emotions. Hope is holding on to positive expectations. Hope is his own people eternally. Hope can mean hold on, pain ends. Hope can mean he offers peace eternal. Some of those might strike you as a wee bit twee, but they do hold some truth. Hope can be all those things for us. They can deal with our past emotions. They can help us to hold on to the positive when times are difficult, and remind us that we have a hope in God that means we are his people eternally, and that there will be peace eternal for each one of us in God's presence. Hope needs to be backed up by faith. We need to have hope in the right person and the right situation, and faith in that same God will bring us the hope that we need. The first instruction in verse 9 in the section we've just read is remember. And it's repeated again in verse 20. Remember. And remembering is more than just a memory. It's more than just recalling or retaining a fact. It's not knowing that certain things happened, that Pakistan got independence on the 14th of August 1947. That's a fact. But remembering what that means for the people of Pakistan is something more. It means recognizing and revisiting that time in our lives. Past victories and high points help us to hope for the same in the future. We remember the goodness of the Lord while we can, and we remember those times when things were good. And that remembering gives us hope that God is still there. And hope is so very, very important. It occurs 5 times in this chapter, in chapter 3 of Lamentations, more than any other chapter in the Bible. A chapter that opens with all those accusations towards God of what he has done to the writer, follows up with the most mentions of the word hope. Hope means to stay, to wait, and to trust. And the first time the word hope is used in the Bible is back in the book of Genesis, chapter 8, verse 12. And it refers to Noah. And it refers to Noah when he was in the middle of his year-long cruise at the time. A little flippant, I know, but you know what I'm saying. Surrounded entirely by water, unable to see anything, Noah had hope because of what God had done in the past. And hopeful waiting is more than just watching the time pass by. It's about trusting in God's goodness. It's not just sitting there and going, oh well, it'll all get better sometime, won't it? Can't go on like this forever, can it? It's about trusting in God's goodness and saying, I know the God that I serve, and I know that he is here with me. The word love in Hebrew is hesed, and it occurs 247 times in the Old Testament. But there is only 3 times, and 2 of them are in this particular chapter, where it's used in the plural sense, which means that it needs, in English, a multiplying word. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, in verse 22 and verse 32, the writer refers to God's great love and his unfailing love. By making it a plural in Hebrew, in English, we need to multiply that word. And so we talk about God's great love and his unfailing love. This is the guy who at the beginning of the chapter is saying what God has done to him, and these are all negative things. He's now talking about God's great love and his unfailing love. His mercies never failing. They never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. In the musical Cats, which is not one of my favourites, I do like a lot of musical theatre, but Cats didn't really do it for me. But the song that most people know, if they know anything from the musical Cats, is the song Memories. And the last words of that song are, daylight, I must wait for the sunrise. I must think of a new life, and I mustn't give in. When the dawn comes, tonight will be a memory too, and a new day will begin. Not words of scripture, but they do echo something of what this passage is talking about. That the darkness will come to an end, and in the morning God will be there. God is still there in the darkness as well, don't forget that. It's not that he's abandoned us. It's not that we've been left alone. But sometimes we don't feel, we're not aware in ourselves of God's presence with us. But the time will come when we will once more know his presence with us. Verse 40. Let us examine our ways and test them, and let us return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and our hands to God in heaven and say, we have sinned and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You have covered yourself with anger and pursued us. You have slain us without pity. You have covered yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can get through. You have made us scum and refuse amongst the nations. All our enemies have opened their mouths wide against us. We have suffered terror and pitfalls, ruin and destruction. Streams of tears flow from our eyes because my people are destroyed. My eyes will flow unceasingly, without relief, until the Lord looks down from heaven and sees. What I see brings grief to my soul because of all the women of my city. Those who were my enemies without cause hunted me like a bird. They tried to end my life in a pit and threw stones at me. The waters closed over my head, and I thought I was about to perish. I called on your name, Lord, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ears to my cry for relief. You came near when I called you, and you said, do not fear. You, Lord, took up my case. You redeemed my life. Lord, you have seen the wrong done to me. Uphold my cause. You have seen the depths of their vengeance, all their plots against me. Lord, you have heard their insults, all their plots against me. What my enemies whisper and mutter against me all day long. Look at them, sitting or standing, they mock me with their songs. Pay them back what they deserve, Lord, for what their hands have done. Put a veil over their hearts, and may your curse be on them. Pursue them in anger, and destroy them from under the heavens, Lord. It's said that Judge Horace Gray of Boston, who would later go on to serve as a Justice of the Supreme Court in the United States of America, once said to a man who escaped conviction on a technicality, I know that you are guilty, and you know it, and I wish you to remember that one day you will stand before a better and wiser judge than me, and that you will be dealt with according to justice and not according to the law. We need to remember that a time is coming when we will be dealt with justice, not according to the law. And the good news for us is that the justice is that we will be free because the price has been paid. Although we are lawbreakers and we continue to be lawbreakers, we are set free because of the blood of the Lamb. And in this final passage of chapter 3, Jeremiah writes 7 principles about the nature of Israel's affliction. Firstly, affliction should be endured with hope in God's salvation, that there will be an ultimate restoration. This is not the end. It will all be all right in the end. If it's not all right, then it's not the end. Number 2, affliction is only temporary and is tempered by God's compassion and love. Yes, there are times in this life when it is grim. I'm never pretended otherwise. But there are also times when it is good. And it is all temporary. When this passing world is done, when has sunk yon glaring sun, we know that this is a passing time, that however long our life on earth may be, it's nothing compared to eternity. And God does not delight in affliction. Some people talk about God as if he enjoys inflicting pain on those that he's created. That's not Jeremiah's view at all. The affliction comes, and it may be necessary for a time, but God is not delighting in it. If affliction comes because of injustice, God sees it and does not approve of it. That's what the Croatian preacher was saying earlier. God sees the injustice. God sees the evil that men and women can do, and he will not approve of it, and he will not allow it to go unpunished. Affliction is always in relationship to God's sovereignty. God is in control. Whatever is happening, God is in control. Nothing and no one has overtaken God's control. It doesn't mean that he is causing it. It doesn't mean that he is the one sending the affliction. But he is in control still. For Judah here, their affliction came because of their sin. It was their fault. And sometimes the trouble we get ourselves into is our own fault. Just because we are forgiven doesn't necessarily mean that we're exempt from the consequences of our actions. If we choose to misuse drugs and end up as a junkie, or end up with collapsed veins or other associated health problems, yes, we can come back to God. Yes, we can receive forgiveness. Yes, we can be clean once more in God's sight. But our body may still pack in because of the consequences of our sins. An affliction for God's people should bring greater good in the end, because it will cause us to turn back to God. Often the trouble comes when we are away from God. Not always. Not always. There are times when people who have been seeking to serve God and have still found themselves in the depths of affliction. You all know my great hero, Corrie ten Boom. She was serving God. She and Betsy and Papa were keeping people safe from the evil of those who would seek to kill them. And yet they still found themselves in a concentration camp. But even through that, God was able to minister and to work, to bring Corrie even closer to God than she already was, and to establish a ministry that went on for years after the end of the Second World War. God will accomplish greater good out of the affliction of his people. So what does that mean for us? Does it mean that we'll be free from trouble now that we're Christians? Of course it doesn't. You know that I'm never going to tell you that. God never promised us a rose garden. Jesus never promised us that life would be easy, but he did promise that he would always be with us, even to the end of the age. Does it mean that we'll always be full of hope, whatever we experience? Probably not. Probably not. And if we don't feel full of hope, we shouldn't condemn ourselves for that. Even Jesus knew what it was to feel the despair and desperation of life. And does it mean that just because we don't feel it, then it's not true? To quote my own story from a few weeks ago, can you feel the blood moving around your body? Can you feel the oxygen diffusing across the alveoli of your lungs? Can you feel your pancreas making insulin? Just because you don't feel it doesn't mean that it's not happening. And just because we don't feel hope, just because we don't feel God's love, doesn't mean that it's not there. What it all means is that God is still in his heaven, and though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the depths of the seas, he is still God. He is unchanging. He is always there, even if he might feel far off. Our confidence is not in flesh and blood. Our confidence is in the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen, in the God who parted the Red Sea, who parted the River Jordan, who brought down the walls of Jericho. That is in whom we have our confidence. We have our confidence in a God who loved us so much that he sent his Son to die for us. And so that whatever the world is throwing at us, we have a hope that is steadfast and certain, that's gone through the curtain and is touching the very throne of God. Whatever situation we face at the moment or face in the future, we can say that great is thy faithfulness. O God my Father, there is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be. Our hope is set on our unchanging God.